We only have one chance and nothing more, said the doctor. But she refused to be just a memory of one night. She gathered courage, destiny, and 2 broken hearts, and turned the impossible into true love. Ice Contract in Warese. Chapter 1. The Abyss. The biting January winds in Stow-on-the-Wold battered the windows of the small flat where Irene Adler had lived for over 30 years. At 62, her face held the marks of a simple beauty that time had not managed to erase completely, only transform. Hands calloused from a life spent serving others meticulously arranged the few medications on the kitchen table, one for blood pressure, another for joint pain, a third that helped her sleep on nights when worries weighed heavier than the thin blankets. The small craft shop she ran in the market. Square barely covered the bills, but it was enough for a modest, dignified life. Or rather it was, until the phone call she received that icy morning. The choked voice of the nurse on the other end of the line was like a dagger. "Mrs. Adler, your brother, Mr. Sebastian, he was in an accident on the motorway. He's in critical condition." Irene's world collapsed in seconds. Sebastian, her younger brother by only 2 years, was the only family she had left. After they had both lost their spouses, she to an inexplicable abandonment, he to a prolonged illness, they had become each others' support, even while living in different cities. "How long until he recovers?" Irene asked, her voice trembling, as she instinctively tidied the grey hair pinned in a simple bun. The silence on the other end said more than any words could. "Ma'am, he's in a coma. We can't predict." In the weeks that followed, Irene's routine turned into a financial nightmare. The hospital in London, where Sebastian was admitted, consumed everything she had saved over years of work. The constant travel, the medications not covered by the basic NHS plan, the nights in the cheap hotel near the hospital, all of it quickly drained her savings. Irene tried everything: bank loans, help from acquaintances, even selling her small stock of crafts at ridiculously low prices, but the debt grew like an avalanche, merciless and impossible to contain. It was on one of those nights, sitting in the hospital waiting room, her eyes red from crying and her body tired from fighting, that Irene saw him for the first time. He entered the room like an imposing shadow, tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that certainly cost more than everything she owned. His dark, well-cut hair contrasting with a few grey strands, at his temples that only enhanced his aura of authority. He walked like someone accustomed to being obeyed, without needing to raise his voice. Even the doctors seemed intimidated when he approached the information desk. "My name is Anthony Rawlins Ashworth. I'm seeking information about the patient in room 413. Sebastian's room. Irene stood up immediately, her heart racing. For a moment she thought he might be a specialist she didn't know, someone who could bring hope. She approached with hesitant steps. "Are you a doctor, sir? Room 413 is my brother's." When he turned, Irene felt the impact of those eyes, dark, deep, but inexplicably empty, as if observing the world through an invisible barrier. "Mrs. Irene Adler, I presume?" Something in the way he said her name made her shiver. "Yes, that's me. We need to talk, in private." Without waiting for a reply, he indicated a small empty meeting room at the end of the corridor. Irene followed him, intrigued and apprehensive. Inside the room he didn't sit, just remained standing, as if he didn't want to prolong the meeting any longer than necessary. "My name is Anthony Rawlins Ashworth, CEO of the Rawlins Group. Your brother, Sebastian Adler, was an accountant at our Manchester branch. I am aware of his situation." Irene blinked, confused. "Sebastian worked for you. He never mentioned—" "There are many things your brother didn't mention, ma'am." Anthony's voice was controlled, without inflection. "Such as the fact that he was investigating certain irregularities in our accounting books before the accident." Irene's blood ran cold. Her Sebastian had always been honest to the core. "My brother is a man of integrity," she defended instinctively. "I didn't say otherwise." Anthony crossed his arms. "In fact, that is precisely why I am here. Your brother discovered an embezzlement scheme that had been going on for years without my knowledge. He was preparing a report to deliver to me personally when he had his accident." Irene felt the world spin. "The accident, was it—" An accident, Anthony completed firmly. We are not in a melodrama, Mrs. Adler. The traffic police confirmed it was a mechanical failure in the lorry ahead of him. Somehow his coldness calmed her. At least it wasn't what she had begun to fear. What do you want from me, then? Anthony pulled an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and placed it on the table between them. I am prepared to cover all of your brother's medical expenses, transfer him to the best private hospital in the country, and bring in specialists from abroad if necessary. I will pay off your current debts and ensure that you never have to worry about money for the rest of your life. Irene felt her heart pound. It was the solution to all her problems, handed to her on a silver platter by a stranger. But years of life had taught her that miracles always come with a price. And what do you want in return? A minimal, almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corner of his lips. You. What? Irene took a step back. I need a wife, Mrs. Adler, by contract for exactly 2 years. The shock was so great that Irene had to lean on the table to keep from falling. Are you proposing marriage? An agreement, he corrected coldly. A marriage on paper. No romance, no physical intimacy, no sentimentality. Just a contract with clear clauses that we will both be expected to respect. But why? I have my reasons which I am not obliged to share. What I can say is that I need to present an image of domestic stability to my shareholders and business partners for this period. You are of a suitable age, have no commitments to prevent it, and have a financial need that I can solve. The proposal was so absurd that Irene almost laughed. A clearly powerful man who could have any young, stunning woman at his feet was proposing a sham marriage to a 62-year-old woman with no special attractions beyond her dignity. Why me? There must be hundreds of women willing to— Precisely because you are not like those women, he interrupted. I don't want romantic complications. I don't want a young woman who will try to seduce me or fall in love. I want someone who understands that this is purely a business transaction, and, most importantly, someone who knows how to follow rules. He slid the envelope towards her. Here is the contract. I suggest you read it carefully. I'm sure you will find the terms generous. You have until tomorrow to decide. And with that, he turned to leave. At the door, he paused for a moment. Oh, and Mrs. Adler, regardless of your decision, your brother's expenses for this week have already been paid. Consider it a gesture of good faith. When the door closed behind him, Irene collapsed into the chair, trembling. With unsteady fingers, she opened the envelope and began to read the contract that would change her life forever. Every line her eyes scanned revealed more of the abyss into which she was about to leap. But when the phone rang again and the nurse informed her that Sebastian would need to be transferred due to non-payment, Irene knew she had no choice. The abyss was already there and she had to jump. Chapter 2. The Ice Ceremony. The morning of the ceremony dawned with a thick fog over London, as if the sky itself had decided to hide what was about to happen. Through the window of the executive car sent by Anthony, Irene watched the streets of the capital pass by in a blur. She wore a simple navy blue suit, bought in a hurry from a department store, the only concession she had managed to wring from Carla Mendoza, Anthony's personal assistant, who had insisted on providing a couture dress. I am not a doll to be dressed up, Irene had said firmly. It was her small victory, a reminder to herself that even in signing this absurd contract, she still retained some control over who she was. The registry office was in the historic center of the city. Anthony was already waiting there, accompanied only by his lawyer and Carla, who cast a disapproving glance at Irene's chosen attire. Good morning, Mrs. Adler. Anthony's voice was formal, as if he were greeting a client in his office, not the woman who would become his wife in minutes. I see you're ready. As ready as I can be, Irene replied, trying to maintain her dignity. Has Sebastian been transferred? Yes, as we agreed. He is at the Wellington Hospital under the care of Dr. Paul Matthews' team, an internationally renowned neurologist. Anthony discreetly checked his watch. Shall we proceed? I have a video conference with Asian investors in 2 hours. The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than 20 minutes. Signatures on documents, no exchange of rings, no kiss, not even a handshake. The registrar seemed slightly confused by the extreme formality, but one look from Anthony was enough to silence any comment. "You are now officially Mrs. Irene Adler Rawlins," the lawyer announced, placing the documents in his briefcase. "Congratulations." No one smiled. There was nothing to celebrate. It was a contract, not a union. In the car on the way to what would be her new home, Anthony finally addressed her again. "Carla will explain all the house rules to you. I expect you to adapt quickly." "Rules?" Irene raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't the contract have enough rules already?" "The contract covers the legal generalities, Mrs. Rawlins." The way he pronounced her new surname sounded strangely formal. "The house rules are more specific. Practical matters concerning how our cohabitation will function." "I see." She didn't really, but she was beginning to realize she had entered a world completely different from her own. Anthony Rawlins Ashworth's world turned out to be a triplex penthouse in London's most exclusive neighborhood, with a panoramic view of the River Thames. The flat occupied the top 3 floors of an ultra-modern glass and steel building, with maximum security and absolute discretion. Upon entering, Irene felt immediately out of place. Everything was cold, angular, minimalist in shades of grey, black and white. Not even the expensive works of art on the walls could bring warmth to the environment. "This will be your room," Carla indicated, leading her to a suite on the 2nd floor of the penthouse. It was spacious, impersonally elegant, like a 5-star hotel room. "Mr. Rawlins occupies the master suite on the floor above. You will not share private spaces." Irene nodded, secretly relieved. "Your wardrobe has been completely updated," Carla continued, opening the doors to a walk-in closet larger than Irene's entire flat in Stow-on-the-Wold. Rows of clothes with famous designer labels, shoes, bags, accessories, all chosen without any consultation of her tastes or preferences. "There was no need for all this," Irene murmured, touching the fine fabric of a dress that probably cost more than her former annual rent. "Mr. Rawlins requires his wife to dress appropriately for her social position," Carla replied mechanically. "Now, the rules." The list was long and detailed. Specific times for meals, which would always be served by the house staff. Protocols for when there were guests. Permitted and forbidden topics of conversation. Even instructions on how to address Anthony in different social contexts. "I can't even choose what I eat," Irene asked, incredulous. "Mrs. Rita, the housekeeper, prepares the weekly menus following the nutritional guidelines of Dr. Ferreira, Mr. Rawlins' personal physician. Naturally, your preferences will be considered within the established restrictions." "Naturally?" Irene repeated, with a slight tone of irony that Carla pretended not to notice. "You will have etiquette lessons 3 times a week with Professor Constance Olivier, an expert in international protocol. They begin tomorrow at 10 a.m. "Etiquette lessons? I'm 62 years old, not a debutante." Carla's look was a mixture of pity and disdain. "Mr. Rawlins moves in the highest social and business circles. His wife must be up to standard." Before Irene could protest again, Carla's phone rang. After a brief conversation, the assistant informed her, "Mr. Rawlins invites you to dinner tonight at 8 p.m. It is important that you are punctual." "Invites me? I thought we lived together now." "Mr. Rawlins values formality, ma'am. I suggest you get used to it." When Carla finally left, Irene collapsed onto the impeccably made bed and allowed herself, for the first time since signing that absurd contract, a few silent tears. What had she done? How would she survive 2 years in this gilded cage, under rules that seemed designed to nullify her identity? But then she remembered Sebastian, fighting for his life, in a luxury hospital, receiving the best possible treatment thanks to this agreement. She remembered the suffocating debts, now all paid. She remembered the alternative, complete ruin. With a deep sigh, she dried her tears. She stood up, went to the immense closet and began to examine the clothes. If she had to dine with her contract husband, she would at least choose something that made her feel a little more like herself. Dinner was served punctually at 8 o'clock in the formal dining room. A long dark wood table where Anthony and Irene sat at opposite ends, like enemy monarchs, of distant kingdoms. The food was impeccable but soulless, technically perfect dishes that looked like they were out of a gastronomy magazine, but evoked no real pleasure when eaten. The conversation was equally arid. Anthony asked perfunctory questions about how she was settling in, if the room was adequate, if she needed anything. Irene responded with short sentences, conscious of the attentive gaze of the housekeeper serving the courses. "Tomorrow there will be a cocktail reception at the Chamber of Commerce," Anthony informed her between precise bites of a fish fillet. "It will be our first public appearance as a couple. Carla has already arranged for an appropriate dress and will give you all the necessary instructions." "Instructions?" Irene put down her fork. "About who will be there, what topics of conversation are suitable, how to behave." "I've known how to behave in public since before you were born," Irene retorted, feeling a spark of irritation break through her facade of resignation. Anthony looked up for the first time since the start of dinner. His gaze was cold, but Irene noticed a glint of something that could have been surprise. "No doubt, Mrs. Rawlins, but the world you are entering has specific rules. I would not wish to see you uncomfortable." "Discomfort is already implicit in this arrangement, Mr. Rawlins." A tense silence followed. The housekeeper seemed to freeze in place, as if afraid of being struck by the ice emanating between the two of them. "Rita," Anthony said without taking his eyes off Irene, "you may leave. We will serve ourselves dessert." When they were alone, Anthony leaned slightly forward. "Mrs. Rawlins, let's be clear about something. This arrangement will work best if you simply follow the established rules. I am not asking for your opinion, only your cooperation." "And I am not questioning the rules, Mr. Rawlins," Irene replied calmly. "I am merely observing that I have enough life experience to know how to conduct myself in public without an instruction manual." Something seemed to cross his face, a flicker of emotion quickly suppressed, like a flame one tries to smother. "You must understand one thing," he said, his voice even more controlled than before. "In my world, people are constantly evaluated. Every gesture, every word, every choice of clothing communicates something. Nothing is left to chance. That is how I built my reputation, and that is how I will maintain it. And I am just another piece in this carefully constructed game," Irene concluded. "Precisely." His frankness was almost refreshing in its cruelty. "As such, I expect you to play your part as agreed." "I will, Mr. Rawlins. After all, a contract is a contract." He seemed satisfied with her response and returned to his meal. Irene watched him carefully, noticing how every movement was calculated, every expression controlled. It was like watching a perfectly programmed machine, efficient, precise, but completely devoid of human warmth. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. At the end, Anthony rose formally. "Good evening, Mrs. Rawlins. I expect to see you ready at 7 p.m. tomorrow for the reception." "I'll be ready," Irene confirmed. As he withdrew, Irene remained seated for a few minutes, contemplating the strangeness of the situation. She had signed a contract to marry a man who clearly saw human relationships as business transactions, who saw her as an object, a temporary acquisition for a specific purpose. And yet, something about him intrigued her. Behind that perfectly controlled facade, she had glimpsed for a second a crack, a moment of real surprise when she challenged him. As if, behind the ice, there was something more. As she went up to her room, Irene thought about the long road ahead. 2 years seemed like an eternity. But somehow, the brief moment she had seen Anthony's mask falter had given her an unexpected sense of power. Perhaps, just perhaps, the rules of this game were not as rigid as he wanted them to seem. Chapter 3. The First Challenge. The hall of the London Chamber of Commerce glittered with the business and political elite of the United Kingdom. Crystals sparkled under the imposing chandeliers. The murmur of sophisticated conversations mingled with the soft notes of a string quartet, and the aroma of gourmet canapés floated among the impeccably dressed guests. Irene, wearing a long emerald-green dress that highlighted her eyes, stood beside Anthony as he spoke with a member of Parliament. The dress, chosen by Carla, was elegant and discreet, perfectly appropriate for a woman of her age and position. But Irene had staged a small rebellion. She wore a mother-of-pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, the only personal piece of jewelry she had brought from Stow-on-the-Wold, instead of the expensive pearls that had been suggested. "And this must be your wife?" the MP commented, turning to her with a cordial smile. "We've heard so many rumors about this sudden wedding, Rawlins. You kept the secret very well." "Irene prefers discretion," Anthony replied smoothly, placing a hand on her back. The first physical contact between them since signing the contract. "Isn't that right, my dear?" The formality with which he pronounced the term of endearment sounded false even to the MP's ears, who raised his eyebrows slightly. "Certainly," Irene agreed with a polite smile. "I've always believed that true happiness doesn't need to be announced in headlines." Anthony shot her, a quick glance as if not expecting such a deft response. "And how did you two meet?" asked the MP's wife, a middle-aged woman with excessive plastic surgery. "It must be a charming story." There was a moment of almost imperceptible tension. Irene realized that, surprisingly, they hadn't rehearsed this obvious part. "Actually," Irene took the initiative before Anthony could answer, "we met because of my brother, who worked for the Rawlins Group." Anthony's expression remained neutral, but Irene felt his fingers press lightly into her back, a silent warning. "Sebastian is on temporary leave for health reasons," she continued, maintaining her composure. "It was during a visit to him in the hospital that Anthony and I met. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways." The explanation, simple and close enough to the truth, seemed to satisfy the couple. "How romantic," sighed the MP's wife, apparently oblivious to the irony. "To find love in a time of difficulty." "If you'll excuse us," Anthony intervened gently, "I need to introduce my wife to some business partners." As they moved away, he leaned in to whisper in Irene's ear, "We didn't agree on that version." "We didn't agree on any version," she retorted in a low voice. "Or would you have preferred I told the truth, that you bought me for 2 years to save your precious empire of appearances?" For an instant, Irene saw something flicker in Anthony's eyes, anger, surprise, or perhaps a reluctant acknowledgement that she was right. "Your story works," he conceded finally. "We'll stick with it." The rest of the evening followed a similar pattern. Anthony introduced her to important people, kept a hand formally placed on her back, and smiled at the appropriate moments. Irene answered questions with carefully constructed phrases, avoiding revealing too much about herself while observing the social dynamics around her. It was during a brief pause when Anthony stepped away to talk with a group of executives that Irene found herself alone near the bar. An elegant woman in her 40s approached, ordering a glass of champagne. "I finally managed to find you without your guard dog," the stranger said with an enigmatic smile. "I'm Julia Peyton, CFO of the Rawlins Group." Irene accepted the outstretched hand, surprised by the direct approach. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Peyton. Julia, please. I think we should be friends considering the circumstances." There was something in the woman's tone that immediately put Irene on alert. What circumstances would those be? Julia took a sip of her champagne, watching Irene over the rim of the glass. "Let's just say I've known Anthony long enough to know when something isn't conventional." She paused deliberately. "Like a sudden marriage to someone completely outside his usual circle." "Love is unpredictable," Irene replied calmly, maintaining the facade. Julia laughed, a melodious but joyless sound. "Love? Anthony?" She shook her head. "My dear, the man turned his heart into an Excel spreadsheet a long time ago." Before Irene could respond, Julia continued, lowering her voice. "Don't worry, I'm not here to expose your secret, whatever it may be. I just want you to know that not everyone in this company is like him. If you ever need an ally, or just someone to have coffee with and talk about something other than acquisitions and mergers, I'm available." She discreetly handed a card to Irene. "Why are you doing this?" Irene asked, pocketing the card. Julia's gaze became momentarily distant. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when Anthony decides he needs someone for a specific role in his life." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm curious to see how you'll fare. Before they could continue their conversation, Anthony materialized beside them as if he had a radar for detecting potential complications. "Julia," he greeted her with a nod, "I see you've met my wife." "We were having a lovely chat," Julia confirmed with exaggerated sweetness. "Your wife is charming, Anthony, so authentic." The way she emphasized the last word made Irene realize that Julia knew more than she let on. "If you'll excuse us," Anthony placed his hand on Irene's back again, but this time the touch felt more possessive. "We need to greet the governor before we leave." Julia leaned in to kiss Irene's cheek in farewell. "Remember my offer," she murmured. "Coffee any day." During the ride back to the penthouse, Anthony remained silent, responding to emails on his phone. Only when the private lift was taking them up to the flat did he finally speak. "I see you met Julia." "Yes, she seemed nice," Irene replied cautiously. "Julia is brilliant at her job, but she has a habit of getting involved in matters that don't concern her," he commented, without looking up from his phone. "I suggest caution. Are you telling me who I can and cannot speak to now?" Irene couldn't hide the irritation in her voice. Finally, Anthony put his phone away and faced her. "I am merely advising you on the complexities of the environment you are now in, Mrs. Rawlins." "Stop calling me that." He raised an eyebrow. "What would you prefer I call you? We have a contract, not a relationship." "Irene. My name is Irene. Mrs. Rawlins makes me feel like property." Something akin to surprise crossed his face. "Very well. Irene." The way he said her name, hesitant, as if testing the sound in his own voice, created a strange intimacy in the confined space of the lift. When they reached the flat, Anthony went to his study without another word. Irene headed to her room, carefully removed the expensive dress and borrowed jewels, and sat on the edge of the bed reflecting on the strange evening. Julia's words echoed in her mind. "I've seen what happens when Anthony decides he needs someone." What exactly had she meant? Had there been other contracts before? And why had Anthony seemed so disturbed to see them talking? The next day, Irene awoke with a new determination. If this was to be her world for the next 2 years, she needed to understand its real rules, not just the ones printed in the contract, and for that, she needed to get to know the man she had married better. The opportunity arose unexpectedly during dinner that evening. Against all established habits, Anthony announced they would be dining together again. "I received positive feedback on our appearance last night," he informed her, as Mrs. Rita served a scallop appetizer. "Your performance was adequate." "Performance," Irene repeated, cutting a tiny piece of the perfectly cooked scallop. "Is that how you see everything in life, as a performance?" Something imperceptible changed in Anthony's posture. "Life is a series of roles we play, Mrs. Irene. Some we choose, others are imposed upon us by circumstances." "And what role are you playing now?" she asked, looking him directly in the eye. "That of a businessman protecting his interests." "Is that all?" For the first time since she had met him, Irene saw genuine hesitation on Anthony's face. "What else would it be?" "I don't know. A man hiding something, perhaps," Julia seemed to imply. The change was instantaneous. Anthony's eyes became 2 blocks of ice, his jaw tightened. "Julia should focus on her work and not on baseless gossip," he cut in sharply. "So they are baseless. This isn't the first time you've made this kind of arrangement?" Anthony placed his cutlery down with military precision. "Mrs. Adler, allow me to remind you of a specific clause in our contract. Matters concerning my private life prior to our agreement are expressly off-limits in our interactions. I suggest you stick to the rules you agreed to follow." The calculated coldness with which he recited those words, the way he deliberately reverted to calling her by her maiden name as a reprimand, sparked an indignation in Irene that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Rules," she said calmly, placing her napkin on the table. "Always the rules. You must have been an unbearable child, Anthony Rawlins, counting the grains of rice on your plate and complaining if one was out of place." The childish taunt slipped out before she could contain it, and Irene immediately regretted it. She expected an explosion of anger, a threat to terminate the contract. Instead, to her complete surprise, a flicker of something like amusement crossed his face. "Actually," he replied with disconcerting calm, "I organized my toys by size, color, and function, and yes, I complained if someone messed them up." For a brief moment, the ice melted, and Irene glimpsed the man behind the corporate facade, an obsessive, probably lonely boy, seeking control where he could find it. It was in that moment, seeing that momentary vulnerability, that Irene made a decision that would change everything. In a calculated, unpremeditated gesture, she reached across the table and placed her hand on his. It was the first time she had touched him, voluntarily. Anthony looked at her hand as if it were an alien object. He didn't pull it away, but his entire body seemed to freeze. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Breaking a rule," Irene replied simply, "to see what happens." His eyes narrowed, studying her as if trying to decipher a complex code. "This is not part of the contract." "No," she agreed, still not removing her hand. "It's not." For a long moment they stayed like that, a fragile connection through that simple touch, a silent challenge floating between them. Finally, Anthony slowly withdrew his hand, not with revulsion but with deliberate consideration. "Mrs. Rita," he called, without taking his eyes off Irene, "you may serve dessert." That night, Irene lay in her luxurious bed reflecting on the moment at dinner. She had risked a lot with that impulsive gesture. She could have angered Anthony to the point where he would reconsider the entire agreement, jeopardizing Sebastian's treatment. But something instinctive told her she had made the right choice. In the brief moment their hands touched, she had seen what Julia had perhaps also perceived, that behind the man of ice was another man, one who was maybe just as trapped as she was, only in a different kind of cage. And as she fell asleep, Irene smiled at the thought that, of all the roles she could play in this strange theatre, perhaps the most interesting would be that of the woman who decided to thaw Anthony Rawlins Ashworth's heart, not for love or obligation, but for the simple pleasure of proving she could. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Pages. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. April arrived in London, bringing the first signs of spring, but inside Anthony Rawlins Ashworth's penthouse, the climate remained unchanged, a constant, controlled coldness that only occasionally showed signs of melting. After the episode of the touch during dinner, a subtle shift had occurred in the dynamic between Irene and Anthony. He had begun to avoid her systematically, expanding his already busy schedule with late meetings, business trips, and corporate dinners. The rare moments they met for scheduled meals were filled with superficial conversations about the weather or economic news. Irene, for her part, had established her own routine. The etiquette lessons with Professor Olivier proved to be surprisingly interesting, not for the rules of behavior themselves, but for the stories the professor shared about the London elite. Irene discovered she was a shrewd observer of human nature, absorbing details and nuances that others ignored. 3 times a week, she visited Sebastian in the hospital. Her brother remained in a coma, but the doctors noted small signs of improvement in his brain activity. During these visits, Irene would read to him, tell him about her day, omitting the more complicated details of her marital arrangement, and sometimes simply hold his hand in silence, finding in that contact an anchor for her own sanity. On a particularly pleasant morning while Anthony was in New York for meetings, Mrs. Rita hesitantly approached Irene during breakfast. "Mrs. Rawlins, could you check something for me in the library? I noticed a small damp patch near the east bookshelf, but my back won't let me move the books to investigate properly." Irene readily agreed, pleased with the opportunity to explore a part of the house she didn't yet know well. The library occupied a considerable space on the first floor, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, rare first editions and technical publications on economics and management. Following Mrs. Rita's instructions, Irene went to the indicated bookshelf and began to carefully remove some books to check the wall behind them. She found no signs of damp, but as she was replacing the volumes, one of them slipped from her hands and fell, revealing a hidden notebook behind the row. Intrigued, Irene hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. It was a simple black-covered notebook, with no external identification. Feeling like an intruder but unable to contain her curiosity, she opened it. The first few pages contained seemingly random notes, dates, initials, references to meetings. The handwriting was unmistakably Anthony's, but different. From the firm, confident signature she knew. These notes seemed more frantic, almost obsessive, with words underlined multiple times and margins filled with observations. Turning the pages, Irene found a name that was repeated. Helen. Sometimes it appeared alone, other times it was violently crossed out, occasionally accompanied by phrases like where or why. Irene's heart quickened. Who was Helen? And why did her name provoke such a reaction in Anthony? Continuing to flip through the notebook, she came to a page that made her freeze. There, written in capital letters and underlined several times, "If I disappear, it wasn't an accident." The sentence was followed by a series of numbers and what looked like coordinates. Mrs. Rawlins. Mrs. Rita's voice made Irene nearly jump. Quickly, she replaced the notebook where she had found it, straightened the books in front of it, and replied, "I didn't find any damp, Mrs. Rita. It must have just been a reflection from the light." The housekeeper seemed relieved. "Oh, good. I worry about Mr. Rawlins' books. He's very particular about his collections." "I can imagine," Irene replied, trying to keep her voice calm while her mind buzzed with questions. For days, the contents of the notebook tormented Irene. The temptation to return to the library and investigate further was almost irresistible, but the risk of being discovered kept her away. Instead, she began to pay renewed attention to everything around her, looking for clues about the mysterious Helen. The opportunity arose when Julia Peyton called, inviting her for the coffee they had mentioned months before. Anthony was traveling again, this time abroad, so Irene readily accepted. They met in a charming cafe in the Mayfair neighborhood, far enough from the Rawlins Group headquarters to avoid chance encounters with other employees. "I must confess, I was surprised when you accepted my invitation," Julia commented after they ordered. "I figured Anthony would have put a tracking chip on you by now." Irene smiled. "He might have tried, but I can still give him the slip occasionally." Julia studied her with renewed interest. "You're not what I expected, Irene. Most people Anthony brings into his life quickly mold themselves into the shape he sets for them." "I'm 62, Julia. I'm too old to be molded." They laughed, and for a moment, Irene felt the simple pleasure of a genuine conversation, something that had become rare in her new life. After a few minutes of casual chat, Irene decided to take a risk. "Julia, do you know someone named Helen?" The effect was immediate. Julia's smile vanished, and she glanced around quickly, as if checking if anyone could be listening. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked in a low voice. "So you do know her?" Julia took a long sip of her coffee before answering. "Helen Vance. She was Anthony's fiancée about 3 years ago." "Fiancée?" Irene couldn't hide her surprise. "What happened?" "Officially, she ended the relationship abruptly and moved abroad." Julia paused meaningfully. "Unofficially, no one knows for sure. One day she was there planning the wedding, and the next she had vanished. Anthony said she'd received an unmissable job opportunity in Paris and decided to prioritize her career." "You don't believe that?" "I didn't know Helen all that well, but the little I saw of her showed me a woman who was deeply in love with Anthony. It made no sense for her to just leave without an explanation." Irene felt a shiver run down her spine as she remembered the sentence in the notebook. "If I disappear, it wasn't an accident." "Do you think something suspicious happened?" Julia sighed deeply. "I'm not implying anything criminal, if that's what you're thinking. Anthony can be many things, but he's not violent. What I do know is that after Helen disappeared, he changed. He became even more controlling, more isolated, and then, less than a year later, he tried an arrangement similar to the one he has with you." "With another woman?" Irene felt an unexpected pang of something she refused to recognize as jealousy. "Yes, a widow, relatively young, desperately needing money to treat her sick child." Julia paused. "It didn't even last 3 months. Anthony broke the contract, paid her a generous settlement, and sent her away." "Why?" No one knows for sure. The rumors in the company ranged from she tried to seduce him to she discovered something compromising. The fact is, after that, Anthony swore he would never get involved with anyone again. Julia looked directly at Irene. Until you came along. The implications of that conversation weighed on Irene all the way back. There was more to Anthony's story than just a businessman obsessed with control and appearances. There was pain, mystery, and possibly danger. Upon arriving at the penthouse, she was greeted by a visibly nervous Mrs. Rita. "Mrs. Rawlins, Mr. Anthony returned early from his trip. He's asking for you." Irene found Anthony in his study, standing by the window, contemplating the view of the Thames. He didn't turn when she entered, but his rigid posture betrayed his awareness of her presence. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice controlled but with an underlying tension. "Having coffee with a friend." "Julia Peyton is not your friend." He finally turned, and Irene was taken aback by the intensity in his eyes. "She is a curious subordinate. Who should be focusing on her work? How did you know it was her? I have resources, Irene, and responsibilities for your safety." The insinuation that she was being monitored angered her deeply. "My safety or your control? I am not a prisoner, Anthony. Our contract doesn't mention that I need permission to have coffee. It's not about the coffee. It's about what was discussed during it." Irene's heart raced. Did he know? How could he know? "I was clear about the rules from the beginning," Anthony continued, approaching her. "My private life prior to our agreement is not a subject for discussion, especially with company employees." Irene lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "Perhaps you should have been more specific in your meticulous contract then, because as far as I know, talking to people and asking questions doesn't violate any clause." Something dangerous glinted in his eyes. For a moment, Irene thought he would lose control, shout or threaten her. Instead, his voice became even lower and more controlled. "What exactly did Julia tell you about Helen?" The name, spoken for the first time by his lips, seemed laden with restrained emotion. "Enough for me to know there's more to this story than a businessman trying to keep up appearances." "You know nothing," he said, turning away abruptly and walking back to the window. "And I suggest you keep it that way, for your own good." The veiled threat did not go unnoticed, but instead of fear, Irene felt a growing determination. This man, with his secrets and walls of ice, would not intimidate her. "Do you know what your problem is, Anthony?" she asked, approaching him. "You're so used to controlling everything and everyone that you've forgotten how to be human. Maybe Helen realized that too." He spun around so quickly that Irene almost took a step back. Almost. "Don't speak of her. You have no idea. You know nothing about me or her or what happened." His voice trembled slightly, the first real flaw she had ever witnessed in his always impeccable demeanor. "Then tell me," Irene challenged softly, "what happened to Helen, Anthony?" For a moment, it seemed he might actually answer. Something vulnerable crossed his face, a pain so deep that Irene felt compelled to reach out to him. But before she could, the mask returned, and Anthony straightened his shoulders. "I have a video conference in 5 minutes," he said, his voice once again under control. "I suggest you prepare for this evening's charity dinner. Carla has arranged for an appropriate dress." And just like that, the moment passed, the connection broken. But as Irene left the study, she knew something fundamental had changed. Anthony could try to hide his secrets behind walls of ice, but she had seen the cracks. And now, more than ever, she was determined to find out the truth about Helen Vance. Not just out of curiosity, but because she was beginning to suspect that the ghosts haunting Anthony might eventually haunt her as well. In her room, while preparing for the evening's event, Irene made a decision. If Anthony wouldn't tell her voluntarily, she would find other ways to uncover the truth. The notebook in the library would be just the beginning. There were other places to look, other people to question. Because now, for the first time since signing that contract, Irene realized she wasn't just playing a role in Anthony Rawlins Ashworth's carefully orchestrated life. She was, in some inexplicable way, becoming part of a larger story, one that had begun long before her arrival and that, perhaps, depended on her to find a different ending than the one it seemed destined to have. Chapter 5. The Awakening. The morning after the charity dinner brought a new reality for Irene. As she watched London slowly wake up through the large window of her room, she realized something had changed within her. She was no longer just the woman who had accepted a contract to save her brother. She was someone who, even at 62, was rediscovering parts of herself she thought were long forgotten. The event the night before had been revealing in several ways. When they arrived at the lavish ballroom of the five-star hotel, where the charity gala for children with cancer was being held, Irene noticed the curious glances she and Anthony attracted. It wasn't just the age difference or the fact that it was a recent marriage. There was something more, an expectation, as if everyone was waiting to see how she would behave. The dress Carla had chosen was an elegant navy blue gown with silver details, appropriate for a woman of her age, but with a touch of sophistication that made her feel almost beautiful. Anthony, as always, was impeccable in his bespoke suit, keeping a hand formally placed on Irene's back as he guided her through the ballroom. During the initial cocktail reception, Irene watched Anthony transform into the perfect host, smiling, charming, completely different from the controlled, cold man she knew in the privacy of their flat. It was like watching a talented actor embody a character, each gesture and expression meticulously calculated for a specific effect. "Anthony is a master of making an impression," a female voice commented beside her, when she was briefly alone while he spoke with some of the event's sponsors. Irene turned to find an elegant woman, in her 50s, with grey hair cut in a modern bob and shrewd eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "Marlene Galloway," the woman introduced herself, extending her hand. "My late husband was a founding partner of the Rawlins Group, along with Anthony's father." "Irene Adler-Rawlins," she replied, accepting the firm handshake. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I must say, I was curious to meet the woman who managed what many considered impossible, marrying Anthony Rawlins Ashworth after the incident." The deliberate choice of the word made Irene tighten her grip slightly on the champagne flute she was holding. "Incident?" Marlene smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Oh, I imagined he would have told you. You are married, after all." She paused meaningfully. "Although, from what I hear, it's a rather unusual arrangement." Irene kept her expression neutral, though her heart had quickened. "People like to speculate about things they don't understand," she replied diplomatically. "Certainly." Marlene took a sip of her drink. "But some speculations are based in reality. I knew Helen, you see. A charming, brilliant young woman. We all imagined she would be Anthony's salvation, that she would finally bring some humanity to his methodical life. And then, poof, she vanished like smoke, leaving only questions behind." Before Irene could respond, Anthony materialized at her side, placing an arm possessively around her waist, another gesture for the audience, but laden with a tension only she could feel. "Marlene," he greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I see you've met my wife. We were having a fascinating conversation about marital commitments," Marlene replied with venomous sweetness. "Your wife is enchanting, Anthony. I hope you know how to appreciate that this time." Anthony's body stiffened almost imperceptibly. "If you'll excuse us," he said, his polite tone barely disguising the implied order. "We need to greet the organizers." As they walked away, Irene felt Anthony's fingers press into her waist harder than necessary. "You shouldn't listen to Marlene," he muttered. "She has always taken a perverse pleasure in stirring up trouble." "And you've always had a special talent for avoiding inconvenient truths," Irene retorted in a low voice, surprising herself with her audacity. Anthony shot her a quick look, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been reluctant admiration. "This is neither the time nor the place," was all he said, before smiling broadly at an approaching couple, instantly resuming his mask of the perfect host. The dinner proceeded without incident, and soon it was time for the speeches. Several business leaders and local celebrities took to the stage to talk about the importance of the cause and announce their donations. When it was Anthony's turn, he delivered a flawless speech on corporate social responsibility, community commitment, and the importance of investing in the future of children. It was while he was speaking, watching him from her table, that something snapped inside Irene. His words sounded empty, rehearsed, devoid of real emotion. And suddenly, without planning, she found herself standing up. "Excuse me," she murmured to the other occupants of the table, heading towards the stage. Anthony was concluding his speech when he saw her approach. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by a forced smile as she climbed the steps to join him. "My wife appears to have something to add," he said into the microphone, an almost imperceptible tension in his voice. Irene smiled at the audience, feeling a strange calm despite the surprised looks. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice firm and clear. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but listening to so many speeches about charity and compassion, I felt I needed to share something personal." From the corner of her eye, she saw Anthony straighten up, his hands discreetly clenched into fists. "Many here know me only as the new Mrs. Rawlins Ashworth, but I was Irene Adler for much longer. I grew up in the Cotswolds, the daughter of a carpenter and a seamstress, in a simple house where we learned the value of hard work and dignity. My brother Sebastian and I didn't have many material privileges, but we had something equally valuable. People who genuinely cared about us." A gradual quiet fell over the hall as she spoke. "Currently, my brother is fighting for his life in a hospital, the victim of a serious accident. And it is because I know firsthand the desperation of watching someone you love suffer without being able to help that I believe initiatives like this are so important. Because in the end, it's not the value of the donations that matters, but the lives they transform." She paused, looking directly at the audience. "Over the past few weeks, I've met many of you, privileged, influential, powerful people. But true, power isn't in the zeros in your bank accounts. It's in the ability to use your resources to make a difference in the lives of those who need it, not just with money, but with genuine empathy and concrete actions. As my mother, who sewed to support our family, used to say, the most valuable fabric is the one that brings people together." A murmur of approval rippled through the hall. Some people clapped spontaneously. Irene noticed that even Marlene Galloway was watching her with a new respect in her eyes. "So on behalf of all the children who will benefit from tonight and on behalf of my brother, who taught me the meaning of perseverance, thank you, not just for your donations, but for your time and for opening your hearts." When she finished, the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood up, some visibly moved. Anthony, beside her, maintained his professional smile, but his eyes conveyed another message, an icy fury that promised consequences. The ride home was conducted in sepulchral silence. Only when the private lift took them to the penthouse did Anthony finally speak. "What did you think you were doing?" His voice was low, controlled, but laden with suppressed anger. "Speaking from the heart," Irene replied simply. "Something you should try sometime." "That was not what we agreed upon. You completely ignored protocol, exposed unnecessary personal details, and turned a corporate event into a television melodrama." "People seem to appreciate it," she observed, surprisingly calm in the face of his indignation. "Several people came to congratulate me afterwards, including people you've been trying to impress for months. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said my speech was the highlight of the evening." This seemed to disconcert him briefly, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's not the point. The point is our contract, the rules we established. Your contract, your rules." Irene walked into the living room, removing the expensive earrings Carla had selected for her. "Do you know what your problem is, Anthony? You're so obsessed with control that you've forgotten how to live. You turn everything, even acts of charity, into carefully calculated business transactions." He followed her, his expression hardening. "You don't understand. My position requires—" "Your position requires you to be a robot," she interrupted him, turning to face him. "Or is that just a convenient excuse to avoid facing your own feelings? To avoid admitting that you're hiding something about Helen, something that terrifies you?" The mention of the name was like a physical blow. Anthony took a step back, his face suddenly pale. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice dangerously low. "No, Anthony. The line was already there, I just made it visible." Irene approached him, unafraid. "Why did Helen disappear? Why do you try to hide any mention of her? What happened that was so terrible you have to bury it under layers and layers of control? Enough! The explosion was so unexpected that they both seemed shocked. Anthony rarely raised his voice. You know nothing. You have no idea, you can't imagine. And then, to Irene's utter surprise, his voice broke. For a fleeting instant, she saw what no one else saw. The man behind the mask, vulnerable, hurt, scared. Instinctively, she reached out, touching his arm. Then tell me, Anthony, what happened? He looked at her hand as if it were a strange object, then at her face. For a moment, it seemed he might actually open up. But then, like a door slamming shut, his expression hardened again. Our contract was a mistake, he said coldly, pulling away from her touch. You are clearly incapable of following basic rules or respecting boundaries. Perhaps we should reconsider the agreement. Irene's heart raced with alarm. Sebastian still needed medical care. The debts still existed. You wouldn't do that, wouldn't I? His voice was glacial. I keep my word when the other party keeps theirs. You have broken our rules, repeatedly. Because your rules are inhuman. She felt tears of frustration welling up, but refused to let them fall. You want a doll, not a wife, someone you can completely control who will never challenge or question you. I want order, stability. His voice rose again. Is that so difficult to understand? No, it isn't. Irene spoke more softly now, seeing past his anger. What's difficult to understand is why you need it so badly. What are you afraid will happen if you let go of the reins, even for a moment? What happened, Anthony, that turned you into this fortress? He turned away abruptly, giving her his back, but not before she saw something in his eyes, a pain so deep it frightened her. This conversation is over. Good evening, Mrs. Adler. The deliberate use of her maiden name was a clear statement, a retreat behind his walls of formality. Without another word, he went up to his room, leaving her alone in the immense, impersonal living room. That night, lying in her bed, Irene cried for the first time since she had arrived in that house of ice. Not out of fear of what Anthony might do, not because of the threat to break the contract, but from a deeper sadness at realizing the prison he lived in. A prison of his own making, with walls so solid that not even he could escape. And it was in that moment, amidst silent tears, that an idea began to form. If Anthony couldn't or wouldn't talk about his past, perhaps there were other ways to find out the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that truth was the key to freeing him, and herself. The next morning, to Irene's surprise, Carla appeared in her room with a message from Anthony. He would be traveling for a few days and expected her to reconsider her behavior during his absence. Instead of feeling chastened, Irene saw an opportunity. With Anthony out of town, she would have the chance to investigate more freely, and her first step would be to meet with Julia Peyton again. The CFO seemed intrigued when Irene called requesting another meeting, but agreed readily. This time, they suggested an even more discreet location, a secluded cafe in Shoreditch, frequented mainly by university students and local artists. I must admit I'm curious, Julia said when they met, especially after the speech at the charity dinner. You're becoming the talk of London, you know? The wife who humanized the robot Rawlins? Irene smiled humorlessly. Hardly, in fact, he's furious with me. I imagined he would be. Julia leaned across the table. What can I do for you, Irene? I suspect you didn't call me here just to gossip about social events. I want to know more about Helen Vance. Julia's expression turned serious instantly. Why this obsession with her? It's not obsession, it's a survival instinct. Irene hesitated before continuing. I found a notebook of Anthony's, with notes about Helen, including a disturbing sentence. If I disappear, it wasn't an accident. Julia visibly paled. Jesus, she murmured. So it was true. What was? There were rumors back when Helen disappeared, that she feared for her safety, that she had confided in friends, that she felt monitored, controlled. But no one took it seriously because, well, it's Anthony Rawlins Ashworth we're talking about, one of the most respected businessmen in the South, a philanthropist, a patron of noble causes. Irene felt a chill. Do you think he... No, Julia interrupted quickly. As I said before, I don't believe Anthony is capable of physical violence, but psychological control, manipulation, absolutely. Look at what he did with you, a marriage contract with clauses that regulate even how you should dress and speak. It was true, and yet Irene couldn't reconcile the controlling but fundamentally insecure man she occasionally glimpsed with someone capable of deliberate harm. I need to find out what happened, she said finally, not just out of curiosity, but because I feel it's at the center of everything. Why he is the way he is, what he expects from this contract with me. And how do you plan to do that? Anthony has buried any information about Helen as deeply as possible. Irene took a deep breath. I'm going to need your help. Julia raised her eyebrows, intrigued. My help? How, exactly? You have access to the company records, right? Did Helen work there? Yes, in the legal department. Julia seemed to understand where Irene was going. You want me to look through the archives? Anything, old addresses, emergency contacts, email records, any clue that could lead me to someone who knew her well. Julia considered for a moment, drumming her fingers on the table. It's risky, she said finally. If Anthony finds out... He's already furious with me anyway, Irene replied with a small smile. Besides, we don't have to tell him. To her surprise, Julia laughed. You know, when I saw you with him at that first reception, I thought, poor lady, she has no idea what she's getting into. Clearly, I underestimated you. Most people make that mistake, Irene replied simply. So, will you help me? Julia nodded slowly. I'll see what I can find. But be careful, Irene. Anthony is not someone who takes kindly to being challenged, and you're entering dangerous territory. I'm already in that territory, Irene replied, thinking of the speech from the night before, of the icy fury in Anthony's eyes. The difference is that now I'm choosing my own path through it. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The 3 days following Anthony's departure became a period of liberation for Irene. Without his watchful eye, without Carla's constant presence monitoring her steps, she rediscovered a feeling she had almost forgotten: autonomy. On the afternoon of the second day, while Mrs. Rita was busy with deliveries in the kitchen, Irene returned to the library. With her heart pounding, she again removed the books hiding Anthony's notebook. This time, she took photographs of several pages with the mobile phone she had secretly purchased, a simple prepaid model that Anthony didn't know she possessed. The notes were confusing, fragmented, often incoherent. Dates, places, crossed-out names. The word manor appeared frequently, sometimes accompanied by coordinates. And that sentence, disturbing in its clarity, if I disappear, it wasn't an accident. On one of the last pages, a note caught her eye. HV. Old file father, safe. Was it a reference to some document about Helen kept in Anthony's safe? Irene knew of the safe's existence. It was disguised behind a painting in his study, but she would never have access to it. On the morning of the third day, she received a message from Julia. Found something. Can we meet? This time, the meeting was at Julia's flat, a comfortable 3-bedroom in Notting Hill. The place was surprisingly cozy, with colourful walls and shelves full of books, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness of Anthony's penthouse. It wasn't easy, Julia explained as she served tea. Anthony practically erased Helen from the company's official records, but he forgot about the old HR department backups. She opened a file on her laptop and turned the screen towards Irene. Helen Vance, 32 at the time she worked with us, law degree from Cambridge with a master's from the Sorbonne. Joined the company as a legal assistant and quickly became one of the most promising lawyers. She met Anthony during a complex merger negotiation where she showed her brilliance. They started dating discreetly, got engaged 6 months later. Irene looked at Helen's photograph, a beautiful woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, with a smile that seemed to light up her face. She was young, yes, but there was something in her posture that suggested determination, inner strength. What happened to her? Julia sighed deeply. Officially, as I said before, she received an unmissable offer in Paris and left suddenly. But she paused as if considering how far she should go. I found someone who might be able to give you more information. Someone who was close to Helen. Who? Ana Lucia Ferrer, Helen's former secretary in the legal department. She was fired shortly after Helen's disappearance, supposedly due to budget cuts. But there were always rumors that Anna knew more than she should. Did you manage to contact her? Better than that. Julia smiled faintly. I've arranged a meeting for you, this afternoon. Irene felt a wave of gratitude. Thank you, Julia. This means a lot. Don't thank me yet. We're wading into dangerous waters. Julia hesitated. I have to ask, Irene, why is this so important to you? Why risk so much for a woman you never even met? It was a fair question, one Irene had been asking herself for the past few days. At first, it was curiosity, maybe self-preservation. I wanted to understand what kind of situation I had gotten myself into. But now, she searched for the right words. It's more than that. When I look at Anthony, I see a man trapped in a prison he built for himself. And something tells me the key to that prison lies in what happened to Helen. Julia studied her for a long moment. You care about him, she said. Finally, not as a question, but a statement. Irene didn't answer immediately. Did she care? Had this cold, controlling man who had bought her like a commodity somehow managed to awaken something other than resentment? I care about the truth, she replied at last, and about justice, whatever that may mean in this situation. Ana Lucia Ferrer lived in a small flat in Reading, a commuter town outside London. She was a middle-aged woman with cautious eyes that examined Irene at length before inviting her in. Julia told me who you are, Anna said after they had coffee. Anthony Rawlins Ashworth's new wife. I'm not sure whether to offer you congratulations or condolences. Irene smiled sadly. Probably both. Why are you here? What do you hope to find? The truth about Helen Vance. What really happened to her? Anna studied her carefully, as if assessing her sincerity. Why do you care about a woman who disappeared before you even met Anthony? Because I think she left something behind, something that continues to affect Anthony, and now by extension, affects me too. Anna nodded slowly, seeming to reach a decision. Helen was my friend, not just my boss. Brilliant, passionate about her work, and initially passionate about Anthony too. She paused. But things changed quickly after the engagement. Anthony started to control her, what she wore, who she spoke to, even her work hours. He installed software on her phone for security, but it was really to monitor her. That sounds familiar, Irene murmured. At first, Helen tried to rationalize his behavior. She'd say he had trust issues because of his father, who had been cheated on several times, that he would get better with time. Anna shook her head. But he didn't. He got worse, especially after she found something in the companies. Old files, something related to Anthony's father. Irene remembered the note in the notebook. HV. Old file father, safe. What did she find? She didn't tell me the details, only that it was serious and that she needed to confront Anthony about it. Anna took a sip of coffee. The following week she started acting strangely, paranoid almost. She said she felt like she was being followed. Once I found her crying in the company bathroom. When I asked what was wrong, she just said, "If I ever disappear, don't believe the official story." A shiver ran down Irene's spine, and then she vanished. Yes, one day she just didn't show up for work. Anthony announced she had accepted a job in Paris, that the relationship had ended amicably. But I knew it was a lie. Helen would never leave without saying goodbye, without taking her personal belongings. Anna leaned forward. I tried to investigate on my own. I called her family in Manchester, who strangely seemed to believe the official story. I checked flight records. No flights to Paris in her name. That's when I started to get really worried. What happened next? I was fired. Anna smiled, humorlessly. Budget cuts, they said. But before that, Anthony called me into his office. I'll never forget his look. Cold, calculating. He said he appreciated my loyalty to Helen, but that I should accept she had moved on, that it would be healthier for everyone if I did the same. It sounds like a veiled threat. Exactly what I thought. That's why I stopped asking questions publicly, but I never stopped looking discreetly. And did you find anything? Anna stood up, went to a drawer and took out a small USB stick. Helen was smart. She knew she was in danger, so she left clues, little breadcrumbs that only someone who knew her well would notice. She handed the USB stick to Irene. I managed to recover some emails she sent to an alternate account she kept, including one with coordinates for a place called Horizon Manor, a country property that belonged to Anthony's father, now abandoned. Irene felt her heart race. Manor, the word that appeared repeatedly in Anthony's notebook. "Do you think she's there? That Anthony?" "No," Anna interrupted firmly. "I don't believe Anthony hurt her physically. He's controlling, manipulative, even emotionally cruel, but not a murderer. I believe Helen discovered something so serious about the Rawlins family that she had to run and hide, and she left clues in case someone like you eventually came looking for her." "Like me? Why would anyone look for me?" "Because you're not the first, Irene. After Helen, there was another, a widow with a sick child, a contract marriage that ended abruptly when she started asking too many questions." Anna pressed the USB stick into Irene's hand. "And now you. I think Helen knew Anthony would try to replace her, to control other women as he tried to control her. And she left, a path so that someone might eventually discover the truth." Irene felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "What should I do with this?" "I would go to the manor. It's about 2 hours from London in the Surrey Hills. The coordinates are in the main file." Anna hesitated. "But be careful, if Anthony finds out. He's already furious with me for other reasons," Irene replied with a small smile. "One more won't make a difference." On the way back to the penthouse, Irene felt simultaneously energized and apprehensive. She finally had concrete clues, a path to follow. But she also understood the risks involved. If Anthony discovered she was investigating Helen, he could terminate the contract immediately, leaving Sebastian without treatment. When she arrived, she was greeted by a visibly agitated Carla. "Where were you?" the assistant asked, her tone accusatory. "Mr. Rawlins has been trying to contact you for hours." "I went to visit my brother at the hospital," Irene lied calmly. "I forgot my phone here." Carla didn't look convinced, but continued. "Mr. Rawlins will be returning tonight earlier than planned. He has asked that you prepare for dinner at 8. It's important." Something in Carla's hesitation alerted Irene. "Important how?" "It's not my place to discuss Mr. Rawlins's affairs." Carla squared her shoulders. "Just be ready." As she prepared for dinner, Irene couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. She chose a simple but elegant dress in a teal blue, one of the few pieces from the wardrobe Anthony had provided that she genuinely liked. She pinned her hair in a low bun and applied light makeup. If this was to be a night of confrontation, she would face it with dignity. Anthony arrived punctually at 7:30. Irene heard him speaking, briefly with Carla in the hall before heading directly to his study, without seeking her out. Typical, she thought. At 8 o'clock sharp, they met in the formal dining room. Anthony looked more tired than usual, small lines of tension around his eyes, but was impeccably dressed as always. "Good evening, Irene," he greeted her, surprising her by using her first name after the distance of the past few days. "Good evening, Anthony. How was your trip?" "Productive." He gestured for her to sit, which she did. "I've had time to reflect on our situation." Something in the way he said situation made Irene straighten her spine, bracing herself. "And did you reach any conclusions?" Anthony nodded to Mrs. Rita, who began to serve the starter, an asparagus soup that Irene would normally enjoy, but which now seemed merely an obstacle between her and whatever Anthony planned to say. "Yes." He waited until the housekeeper had left to continue. "Our arrangement is not working as expected. You consistently challenge the established rules, seek information that was explicitly declared off-limits, and have created a public persona that was not what we agreed upon." Irene kept her expression neutral, though her heart had quickened. "I am fulfilling the essential clauses of the contract. I appear where I'm supposed to, say what's expected in public, and maintain discretion about the nature of our agreement. But not in the way I specified." Anthony took a sip of wine, watching her over the rim of the glass. "Your speech at the charity event was unexpected." It was sincere, Irene corrected. Something you might try occasionally. Instead of getting irritated by the jab, Anthony surprised her with a faint smile. It is precisely because of that frankness that I am reconsidering our situation. This was it. The moment Irene had been dreading, the termination of the contract, the end of Sebastian's treatment, the return to debt and uncertainty. You're going to nullify the contract. It wasn't a question. No. The answer caught her completely off guard. I'm going to alter it. Alter it how? Anthony placed his cutlery carefully beside his plate, a meticulous gesture she now recognized as a sign that he was organizing his thoughts. During my absence, I received several phone calls, from the President of the Chamber of Commerce, from 2 MPs, even from the Mayor, all of them praising my charming and authentic wife. There was an almost ironic note in his voice. Apparently your speech impressed people I've been trying to influence for years. Irene couldn't suppress a small smile. Are you telling me my insubordination was actually good for business? I'm saying that your authenticity has value, a value I did not anticipate when I drafted our original contract. For a moment, Irene didn't know how to respond. This was not the conversation she had expected to have. So, what are you proposing? A new agreement. Anthony leaned back in his chair. One that gives you more freedom in certain aspects. Fewer rules about your appearance, your words in public, your general behavior. In return, I expect more public appearances by my side, especially at corporate and political events. Irene narrowed her eyes, suspicious. Why? What's changed besides a few complimentary phone calls? Anthony studied her for a long moment before answering. Perhaps I underestimated your capabilities. You have turned what was supposed to be a decorative position into something with real influence, and I would be a fool not to leverage that. It was a surprisingly honest admission, perhaps the most sincere he had ever been with her. And what about your private territory? Your secrets? Helen? The change was instantaneous. Anthony's face closed off completely, his eyes once again becoming distant. That remains off limits, non-negotiable. Even if those secrets are affecting our present. Even if they're the reason you've become this man of ice who needs contracts to relate to people. Anthony stood up abruptly, throwing his napkin onto the table. I see it was a mistake to think we could renegotiate civilly. You clearly don't understand boundaries. And you don't understand that you can't compartmentalize life like you do your businesses. Irene also stood, facing him. You're past your secrets, whatever happened with Helen. It's all connected to the present, to the man you've become. For a moment it seemed he would simply walk out, end the conversation as he always did when pressed. Instead, to her surprise, he moved closer, stopping just inches away. What exactly do you want to know, Irene? What do you think you'll discover? There was something almost vulnerable in his voice now, a crack in the perfect armor. The truth, she replied simply. About you, about Helen, about what happened that was so terrible you had to bury it so deep. Why? How does that affect our agreement? Because I can no longer pretend it's just an agreement. The words came out before she could stop them. Because in some inexplicable way, I've started to care about the man behind the contract. The confession hung between them, unexpected, too honest to be ignored. Anthony recoiled slightly, as if her words had a physical impact. You don't know me, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You don't know what I'm capable of. Then show me. Tell me. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Irene could see the internal battle in his eyes, the desire to keep his walls up against something deeper, more human. Helen is alive, he said finally, the words coming out as if each one cost him a physical effort. She ran away. From me. From what she discovered about my family. Irene's heart pounded. What did she discover? Anthony closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. My father was not the respectable man everyone thought he was. There were irregularities in the early years of the company, money from questionable sources, people who were harmed. He took a deep breath. Helen found documents, proof, that my father had built his initial empire with methods that bordered on illegal. When she confronted me, I didn't react well. You threatened her. No! The denial was vehement. I tried to explain, to justify. I said it was the past, that I had turned the company into something legitimate, respectable. But she was a lawyer. She understood the legal implications. She said she needed to think, that she couldn't just ignore what she'd discovered. And then she disappeared. Anthony nodded slowly. A week later, I received a letter. It just said, "I can't live with this, nor can. I report you this is the only solution. Don't look for me." Did you believe it? I wanted to. It was easier than facing the alternative, that she had left me because she found out who I really was, who my family really was. The vulnerability in his voice was palpable now. Irene instinctively moved closer, touching his arm. But you didn't just accept it. No. I tried to find her, hired investigators, searched for months. Nothing. He ran a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristically disheveled gesture for him. Eventually, I had to accept that she had chosen to disappear, that she would rather literally erase her existence than be with me. And the manner, the coordinates in your notebook. Anthony's eyes widened in shock. How did you... He took a step back. You read my personal notebook. You invaded my privacy to that extent. Irene stood her ground. Yes, because I knew you would never tell me voluntarily, and because I needed to understand the man I had a contract with. She expected anger, an explosion, perhaps even threats. Instead, Anthony just seemed defeated. The manor was a special place for us, where we planned to build a house, away from the city. The coordinates, I kept going back there, hoping to find some clue, some sign of her. The confession hung in the air between them, laden with pain and regret. Irene realized she was seeing for the first time the real Anthony Rawlins Ashworth, not the calculating businessman, not the contract husband, but the wounded man who had lost someone he loved and had never fully recovered. "You still love her," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement. Anthony didn't answer directly, but his silence was answer enough. "Is that why you create these contracts? To have the appearance of a relationship without the risk of another abandonment?" "I created rules," he said finally, "because rules are safe, clear. When everything is defined in a contract, there's no room for interpretation or disappointment." "Or for real feelings," Irene completed. "Exactly." They stood in silence for a long moment, the air between them charged with revelations and long-hidden truths. Finally, Anthony spoke again. "What do you intend to do with this information?" Irene hesitated. Should she tell him about Ana Lucia, about the USB stick, about the possibility that Helen had deliberately left clues? Or would that just reopen wounds he was clearly trying to heal? Before she could decide, a sound interrupted the moment, Anthony's phone ringing insistently. He answered with visible irritation, but his expression quickly turned to shock. How? When? His voice had an urgency Irene had never heard before. "I'm on my way." He hung up, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of concern, relief, and something that might have been gratitude. "Your brother has woken up from his coma." Chapter 7. The Awakening of Souls. The news hit Irene like a wave, warming, drowning, and reviving her. All at once, Sebastian had awakened from his coma. Without hesitation, she and Anthony rushed to the hospital, leaving their unfinished conversation and the recent revelations momentarily suspended in the air. During the entire drive in the luxury car that wound through the nocturnal streets of London, Irene remained silent, her mind torn between joy for her brother's recovery and the confessions Anthony had just made. Helen was alive. She had fled deliberately, and Anthony, behind his controlled exterior, was just a man trying to protect himself from the pain of another abandonment. When they arrived at the Wellington Hospital, Dr. Paul Matthews was waiting for them, his face showing the typical weariness of a doctor at the end of a long shift, but also the glow of positive news. "Mrs. Rawlins Ashworth," he greeted. still unaccustomed to Irene's new surname. Mr. Rawlins Ashworth. Mr. Adler's awakening was unexpected but extremely promising. He is conscious, recognizing people and his surroundings, and has even managed to speak a few words. "Can I see him?" Irene asked, barely able to contain her emotion. "Certainly, he's been asking for you." Anthony, who had remained slightly apart, stepped forward. "You should go in alone," he said, surprising her. "It's an important moment." There was something new in his tone, a genuine consideration that was not part of his usual repertoire of calculated gestures. "Thank you," she replied, briefly touching his arm before following the doctor down the corridor. When she entered the room, Irene felt tears well up as she saw Sebastian, pale, thinner, but with his eyes open and alert, focused on her. "Renee," he murmured, using her childhood nickname. "How long—" She rushed to his side, holding his hand between hers. 3 months, Seb. 3 long months." As they spoke in low voices, he asking halting questions, she answering carefully, omitting the more complicated aspects of her current situation, Irene felt a strange sense of unreality. How could she explain to her brother that, to save him, she had entered into a contract marriage with one of the most powerful men in the UK? After nearly an hour, the doctor suggested that Sebastian needed to rest. When Irene left the room, she found Anthony not in the waiting area, but speaking with Dr. Matthews in his private office, its frosted glass doors obscuring the view, revealing only silhouettes. When they noticed her, the conversation stopped. Anthony came out, his face once again composed in its usual mask of control, but there was something different in his eyes. A new resolution, almost a serenity that wasn't there before. "How is your brother?" he asked, as they walked towards the exit. "Conscious, talking. The doctor says he'll need intensive physiotherapy, but the outlook is good." Anthony nodded. "I've already arranged it. The best specialists in neurological rehabilitation will be available to him." Irene stopped, turning to face him. "Even after everything that's happened? What I discovered? The rules I broke?" Something resembling a smile touched his lips. "A contract is a contract, Irene, and I always uphold my end of the bargain." Those words, which once would have sounded cold and calculating, now carried a different meaning, a particular honor, a code he followed strictly, perhaps the only constant in a life marked by painful revelations and buried secrets. Back at the penthouse, the silence between them had acquired a different quality. It was no longer tense or heavy with unspoken words, but contemplative, as if both were reassessing everything they knew about each other. It was Anthony who finally broke the silence when they reached the living room. "You didn't tell me." "Everything you discovered," he said, not as an accusation but as a statement. "About Helen, there's more, isn't there?" Irene hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. "Yes, I spoke with Ana Lucia Ferrer, Helen's former secretary." Anthony stiffened visibly at the name. Ana Lucia. Of course. She never believed the official story. "She gave me something." Irene took the USB stick from her purse. Emails that Helen sent to a secret account, including coordinates for Horizon Manor. For a long moment, Anthony just stared at the small object in her hand, as if it were both precious and dangerous. "You think she deliberately left clues? That she wanted to be found?" "I think she left a path to the truth," Irene replied carefully. "And I believe we need to follow that path, Anthony. Not just for Helen, or for you, but for us, for whatever future we might have, whatever that may be." "Us?" The word sounded strange on his lips, as if it were a new and unexplored concept. "Yes, us. Because, whether you admit it or not, we are no longer just parties to a contract." Irene moved closer, daring to touch his face. "We are two people who, in some unlikely way, have started to care about each other." He didn't flinch from her touch as he would have months ago. Instead, his eyes closed briefly, as if absorbing the sensation. "It's dangerous," he finally murmured. "To feel." "It's human," she corrected softly. "And you've been running from that for too long." The next morning, under a spring sky that promised warmth and clarity, they set off towards Horizon Manor. Anthony insisted on driving himself, dismissing his usual chauffeur. The car followed the road that snaked through the hills of Surrey, taking them further and further from the urban civilization of London. "Helen and I found this place by accident," Anthony commented, breaking a long silence. "We were driving aimlessly one weekend, escaping the city. The property was abandoned. It belonged to my father, but he never visited it. There was an old, simple house, but with an incredible view of a valley." "You plan to live here?" "Eventually." Helen dreamed of restoring the house, creating a place just for us, away from the pressures of the company, of society. His voice had a distant quality, as if he were recalling not just facts but long-buried sensations. "It was the only place I ever felt free." Irene absorbed this confession silently, understanding its depth. For a man who lived by rules and control, the feeling of freedom was likely as rare as it was valuable. After nearly 2 hours, the main road gave way to a dirt track. Eventually, Anthony stopped the car in front of an aged wooden gate, almost overgrown with vegetation. "This is it," he said, his voice tense. They walked in silence up the path that led to the house, a simple stone and wood structure, clearly old but with an undeniable rustic charm. Nature had begun to reclaim the place. Vines climbed the walls, small plants sprouted between the deck's floorboards, and the garden that must have once been well tended was now an extension of the surrounding woods. Anthony stood still for a few moments, just looking at the house, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I haven't been here in over a year," he admitted. "After searching for months without finding anything, it became too painful." Irene looked around, trying to imagine the place as it might have been, a refuge for two lovers, a symbol of future dreams. "Are the coordinates, Helen, sent specific to this house or to a point nearby?" Anthony took out his phone, checking the file Irene had shared with him. "To a point about 100 meters from here, in that direction." He pointed towards a wooded area beyond the house. They followed the almost non-existent trail, moving away from the building. The woods grew denser, the air cooler under the shade of the trees. Finally, Anthony stopped. "This must be it." They looked around, searching for something that could be a clue, a landmark, anything Helen might have left. There was nothing obvious, just trees, bushes, the occasional bird call. "What exactly are we looking for?" Irene asked, feeling slightly lost. Anthony didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be recalling something, his eyes scanning the area as if searching for a specific memory. "There was a tree," he said finally, "a golden trumpet tree that Helen loved. We used to sit under it on summer afternoons." They walked a few more meters, and there it was, a majestic tree, not yet in bloom at that time of year, but imposing in its size and position, dominating a small clearing. As they approached, Anthony suddenly stopped, his body as tense as a violin string about to snap. "Anthony?" Irene followed his gaze. On the trunk of the tree, almost hidden by the growth of moss and lichen, was a small metal plaque. Anthony approached as if in a trance, his fingers tracing the engraved words. "For AR. Some secrets are prisons we build for ourselves. The truth, however painful, is the only path to freedom. HV." A strange sound escaped Anthony's throat, something between a sigh and a stifled sob. Irene respectfully kept her distance, allowing him to absorb the private message. "She knew," he murmured finally. I knew I would come here eventually, that I couldn't stay away forever." "What do you think she meant?" Irene asked softly. "That secrets are prisons?" Anthony stepped away from the tree, facing Irene with an expression she had never seen before, completely open, without masks or defenses. "The same secrets I tried to hide from you. The truth about my father, about the start of the company, but also my own secrets, the fear of being vulnerable, of losing control, of loving without guarantees." He took a deep breath as if preparing to dive into unknown waters. "When Helen discovered the truth about my family's past, that wasn't what drove her away, it was my reaction. My refusal to face that truth, to acknowledge my father's mistakes and move on. Instead, I tried to control the situation, control her, keep everything perfectly ordered and compartmentalized." Irene moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "As you've done your whole life," Yes, he nodded slowly. My father was a volatile, unpredictable man. We never knew which version of him we would find when we came home, the charming businessman or the domestic tyrant. I learned early on that the only way to survive was through absolute control of everything I could possibly control. And Helen threatened that control. She didn't just threaten it, she exposed its illusion. She showed me that no matter how much we try to control life, some truths cannot be contained. They emerge, eventually. Irene looked at the plaque again, the simple but profound words engraved there. She didn't leave you out of hatred, Irene observed. She left so that you could eventually find your own path to the truth. And for her own protection, Anthony added, his voice low, I was willing to do anything to keep my family's legacy intact, to preserve the reputation of the Rawlins Group. Anything. The implication hung between them, unsaid but clearly understood. Not physical violence, perhaps, but there were many ways to silence someone. Where is she now? Irene asked. I don't know, Anthony admitted, and perhaps it's for the best. She made her choice, built a new life away from me, away from all of this. He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing not just the manor, but his entire previous existence. And you? What choice will you make now? The question hung between them, filled with possibilities and uncertainties. Anthony looked around, at the clearing, at the house in the distance, at Irene. I don't know if I still have a choice, he said finally. I've built an entire life based on control and appearances. I don't know if I can just abandon all of that. It's not a matter of abandoning, Irene corrected gently. It's a matter of transforming, of using the power and influence you have for something better, of allowing yourself to be human with all the risks and uncertainties that entails. He studied her for a long moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. How do you do it, Irene? How do you face life with such courage after everything you've been through? The question caught her by surprise. No one had ever asked about her courage, about how she survived life's trials. One day at a time, she answered honestly, by accepting that I can't control everything but that I can control how I respond, by finding beauty in the small moments, and most of all, by allowing myself to feel the pain, the joy, everything. A distant sound interrupted their conversation, Anthony's mobile ringing insistently in his pocket. He ignored it for a few seconds, keeping his gaze fixed on Irene, before finally answering. The call was brief, but the change in his expression was remarkable. When he hung up, there was a mixture of shock and something akin to hope on his face. What was it? Irene asked, apprehensive. Helen, he replied, his voice almost a whisper. She contacted the company today, sent an email to Julia. Irene's heart raced. What did it say? Just that she's well, living in France, and that— he hesitated, as if the words were difficult to pronounce— that she's ready to talk if I'm ready to listen. And are you? Anthony looked again at the plaque on the tree, then at Irene. Something seemed to be settling within him, like ice finally giving way to the first warmth of spring. Yes, he said at last. I think I am. 3 weeks later, life had taken on entirely new rhythms. Sebastian had progressed remarkably in his recovery, already sitting up on his own and beginning to take supported steps. The story of Irene's marriage to Anthony had been explained to him, not all the details, but enough for him to understand the situation. To Irene's surprise, Sebastian showed no horror or indignation at the arrangement, only a quiet understanding of the sacrifice his sister had made for him, and a curious acceptance of Anthony, who visited the hospital regularly, no longer as a distant patron, but as someone genuinely interested in his brother-in-law's recovery. At the penthouse, the changes were even more profound. The rigid rules that had governed the first months of their cohabitation were gradually abandoned. Irene now chose her own clothes, ate what she pleased, went out when she wanted. Mrs. Rita occasionally smiled. Carla seemed perpetually confused by the new dynamic, and Anthony himself. Anthony was changing day by day, as if layers of ice were melting to reveal the man beneath. It wasn't a complete or immediate transformation. There were still moments of rigidity, of excessive control, of emotional retreat. But there were also new moments of vulnerability, of unexpected laughter, of hesitant touches that were not part of any contract. One afternoon, while Irene was reading in the library, now her favorite place in the house, Anthony entered carrying a set of documents. "What's this?" she asked, marking her page. He sat beside her, placing the papers between them. "Our original contract," he said, his voice calm. "And a new version." Irene looked at the documents with apprehension. "A new version?" "The original terms expire in 18 months, he explained. "I thought, perhaps, we could negotiate something different for the future." There was a hesitation in his voice, a vulnerability that touched her deeply. "What kind of terms do you have in mind?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, though her heart had quickened. Anthony pushed the papers aside and, in a surprisingly spontaneous gesture, took her hands in his. "More open-ended terms. No clauses about how you must dress, speak, or behave. No restrictions on who you can see or where you can go." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "With no expiration date." The implication of those words hung between them, enormous and undeniable. "Anthony," Irene began cautiously, "are you asking me to continue as your wife, voluntarily?" "I'm asking for us to build something real," he replied, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Something not based on contracts or obligations, but on choice, your choice this time." Irene felt unexpected tears form in her eyes. "Why, what's changed?" "Everything," he answered simply. "You changed everything, Irene. You showed me that. There is strength in vulnerability, that there is freedom in accepting the truth, that there is value in feeling, even when it hurts." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I am not an easy man. I am still learning. I still make mistakes. I still fight the impulse to control everything around me. But for the first time in my life, I want to be more than this limited version of myself. And in some inexplicable way, you make me believe that's possible." Irene studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine vulnerability in his expression. This was not the Anthony Rawlins Ashworth who had proposed a cold contract in a hospital months ago. This was a man in the process of transformation, finding his way back to the humanity he had buried under layers of control. "And Helen?" she asked, needing to know. "Did you two talk?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Via video call last week. It was difficult, painful, necessary." He paused. "She's well. She's built a new life. She's not coming back, nor do I expect her to, but we found a kind of peace, a closure. And your family's secrets, the documents, I'm dealing with them," he said firmly. "I've hired an independent legal team to review the company's entire history, identify any past wrongdoings, and make reparations where possible. It won't be easy or quick, but it's the right thing to do." Irene felt a surge of pride for him, for this man who was learning the hard way that facing the truth, however painful, was better than living in a prison of secrets. "And what about us?" she finally asked, the question that hung between them. "What do you really want, Anthony? No contracts, no clauses, just the truth." He hesitated for only a moment before answering, his voice low but firm. "I want the chance to learn to love you, Irene. Not as an acquisition, not as a contract wife, but as the extraordinary woman you are. The woman who was brave enough to challenge my rules, who saw past my walls, who showed me there is life beyond control." The words, so simple and direct, hit Irene with unexpected force. It wasn't a grand declaration of eternal love, but it was something possibly more valuable. An honest promise, an acknowledgement of a path that still needed to be walked, but one he was willing to travel. "And if I say no," she asked, testing him one last time, "if I decide that, with Sebastian recovering, I want to take back my independent life?" "Then I will respect your decision," he answered without hesitation. "I will uphold my part of the original agreement, Sebastian's treatment, your debts, your financial security, no strings attached." The sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. There was no manipulation there, no attempt at control. Just a man offering his imperfect heart and hoping it would be accepted. Irene stood up, walking to the window overlooking the Thames. The river looked different now. No longer an impressive view from a gilded cage, but a horizon of possibilities. She thought of everything she had lived through in the past few months, the initial desperation, the forced adaptation, the small rebellions, the surprising discoveries, and she thought of Anthony, not just the man she had initially met, cold and controlling, but the man who was now emerging, a man capable of changing, of growing, of facing his deepest fears. When she turned back to him, Irene had already made her decision. "I don't want a new contract," she said firmly. His face fell, a raw vulnerability, momentarily exposed before he could hide it. "I understand," he said formally, already beginning to compose himself. "No," Irene interrupted, moving closer again. "You don't understand. I don't want a contract, because what I'm offering can't be reduced to clauses and paragraphs." She took his hands, feeling them tremble slightly under her touch. "I'm offering a partnership, a path we will walk together day by day, choosing each other, not because a piece of paper obligates us, but because we want to." Understanding dawned slowly on Anthony's face like the sun rising after a long night. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I also want the chance to learn to love you, Anthony Rawlins Ashworth. The real man, not the businessman, not the contract husband. The man who is learning to feel again, to trust, to live beyond the walls he built." The smile that transformed his face then was like nothing she had ever seen before. Open, genuine, almost boyish in its unguarded hope. Without words, he pulled her to him, holding her not with the calculated precision of his previous public gestures, but with the abandon of someone finally allowing himself to feel fully. When they parted, Irene took the original contract from the table and in a symbolic gesture tore it in half. "No more imposed rules," she declared, "only the ones we create together, based on mutual respect and constant choice." "No more controls," he agreed, adding his own piece by tearing the document again. "And no more secrets," Irene completed, looking him in the eye. "No more secrets," Anthony promised, his voice steady despite his visible emotion. In that moment, looking at the torn pieces of what had once been their cold, calculated agreement, Irene understood the truth of Helen's message. Some secrets were indeed prisons we build, for ourselves, and the truth, however painful to face, was the only path to freedom. Anthony and Irene still had a long road ahead. There would be difficult days, setbacks, moments when old habits would try to resurface. But now there was something that hadn't existed before, a foundation of honesty, a willingness to grow, and the shared understanding that the true value of a relationship lay not in the guarantees it offered, but in the vulnerability it allowed. 2 months later, in a simple ceremony in the restored garden of Horizon Manor, Anthony and Irene renewed their vows, this time with no contracts, no lawyers, just close friends, a smiling Sebastian in his wheelchair, and promises made not on paper, but in the heart. And as the sun set over the Surrey hills, bathing the couple in golden hues of promise, Irene thought of the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. A journey that had begun with a contract of ice, but was now blossoming into something far more precious and rare. A love freely chosen, day after day, with no guarantees beyond the conscious decision to keep choosing each other. The gesture that had once broken the code of ice, her hand on his, not in seduction but in defiance, had transformed into something much more powerful, a symbol of genuine connection, of demolished barriers, of hearts finally free to feel. And in the end, they discovered together that the true opposite of control was not chaos, as Anthony had always feared, but trust. The trust to allow oneself to be vulnerable, to accept life's uncertainty, and to recognize that real love could never be contained in clauses and paragraphs, only lived one day at a time with all the courage they could muster.